I am Dr. Narda Robinson, osteopathic physician and veterinarian, and the founder and CEO for CuraCore Vet and CuraCore Med. And today we're going to talk about better living through chemistry and where that all came from and how we can kind of battle the just invisible pressures that we feel as physicians, as veterinarians. My group today is mainly targeting veterinarians, but there's a lot of stuff that has filtered into our consciousness that we may not even be aware of. So my goal for today, let's move forward, is to give you these three ideas, these three things to know, that seeking to fix mental and or physical problems through chemical alterations is not new, and it's not limited to humans. And convincing the public that synthetic chemicals are essential to the good life, began from industry. And of course, we'll see a little bit about DuPont and its role in things. And while we're going to talk about these big behemoth organizations, the thing to extract that I'd like you to extract from this is that, again, these unseen influences that are coloring our experiences, whether it's as veterinarians, as veterinary students, even for clients, what your veterinarian or healthcare provider, your physician present to you as options will be influenced by what's happening in industry. And a lot of you don't get that because when you're in school, they're not saying, well, I got a $500,000 grant from X drug company. And so when I talk to you about your various options for either pain control or gastrointestinal problems or skin problems, I would like to disclose to you that I have a potential conflict of interest because my research is funded by these people and I get a lot of kickbacks from them. So that's unlikely that would be something that a faculty member at a college for healthcare practitioners would disclose. However, we're going to lift the little blanket and see what's under there and maybe get a different read on things. So again, if you have questions at any time, feel free to write them in the question section, and I will be checking. When I go like that, I'm checking to see if there's any questions. So we're going to talk a little bit about big industry, a little bit about big pharma. So how does big pharma pay and reward healthcare providers for pushing pharmaceuticals? And academia then conditions you so that you're ready for when you give talks at meetings or when you're attending them, when you're incentivized to get this beautifully carved little dog bowl with your own dog's name on it. And it's like, oh, okay, that company is so nice. And I have this little memento that my baby can share with me for the rest of our lives. So those kinds of things are just these subconscious kind of attributes that I want to make more conscious. So how can we do better? So for a long, long time, decades, I don't know about centuries, but yeah, opium has been around a long time. So as I started out by saying, it's not new and it's not big pharma's fault that humans tend to have an attraction to using various chemicals, whether it's for emotional changes, for relaxing, for curing something. And I have tons of antique books, and I was going to use some of that, but I think the bigger story today is about what's happening nowadays. But just reading through back to the 1800s, how healthcare providers would be given prescriptions to stir up something for cows, for sheep, for humans, for your family members. If you're out in, this new world of Kansas or something and you guys are all by yourselves, how do you do home remedies? So back when, they learned a lot from the Native Americans that they encountered, and there were European influences in terms of botanical remedies. Physicians might have gone over to Europe to learn, but in the time when some of the procedures that we still have nowadays were evolving, and even the heroic medicine of its day, which had bloodletting and mercurous chloride and all these mercurial compounds, really dangerous stuff. When those were being given, that information was either coming from Europe or it was apprentices learning from each other. And so from each other or from a physician, there wasn't really a medical school. That came out in the 1900s, the early 1900s. So medicine was kind of haphazard, and the Food and Drug Administration wasn't even created until the early 1900s. And the benefit of that was that it removed some of these poisons that were being tested. It was really just catch as catch can, and people like to say the Wild West, but it really was the Wild West. And so this sought to bring some regulation to things. Now things have evolved. But as I said, it's not unique to humans that some individuals seek things in nature, whether it's exogenous chemistry like catnip here, and you're seeking it out, and you're an animal that is working through zoopharmacognosy kind of things, and you're seeking out plants or minerals in your environment that have a health benefit or some kind of relaxing benefit. So that's kind of intrinsic, that's in the DNA. But you don't really see cats trying to overindulge. They'll just roll over and rest for a while. So that's more of a human thing. But just realizing that there are exogenous chemicals in the environment, whether it's plant-based or other, and there is your own internal pharmacopoeia. So back in the mid-19th century, when osteopathic medicine came about, and Andrew Taylor Still, who was an MD trained, saw that there were such dangerous mainstream, now we call it allopathic approaches, that he wanted to find something better. And that's where he recognized these links between structure and function, and just how if you see something wrong anatomically, then there are going to be problems functionally. And the more you do something wrong, overuse something, then you are going to translate that function, that dysfunction, into some kind of anatomical change, whether it's arthritis or some kind of tendinitis or something like that. But way before his time, Andrew Taylor Still did discuss this endogenous internal pharmacopoeia that we have. And it really wasn't until the 1970s that Candace Pert, who's a PhD, discovered endorphins, endocoids or endorphins. And then things went along from there. But again, it's quite advanced to think that this idea that we have some kind of chemistry inside ourselves that responds to the chemistry of plants, even to the extent, so beyond the opium poppy, even to valerian and your endogenous benzodiazepine system. And now we are quite enthralled with the cannabis situation and endocannabinoid system. So there's lots more to learn than has typically been appreciated, and especially when you have faculty members that have been, dare I say, indoctrinated into the drugs and surgery mindset, and that are teaching you, and what are they going to teach you? So if we go back to even the expression better living through chemistry, that is actually a term that was retrofit onto DuPont. They had a different lingo, and I'll present that to you soon. But Better Living Through Chemistry is actually turned into a movie that might be entertaining to watch. But the story of DuPont is important because this is, I want to say pathognomonic, but it's demonstrating, again, the pervasive and unseen influences that have affected so many of us and still are appearing this day, and these times, and are even potentially getting worse again. So DuPont was originated by this French individual, DuPont, who was a chemist, came over here from Europe and started out in Delaware in 1802. And so they began by creating these explosives and gunpowder, because in America, the market wasn't that robust or anything. And so they had a way to get a foothold here and then expanded that to other chemical compounds. And in fact, in the 19th century, DuPont supplied up to 50% of the gunpowder used by the Union Army during the American Civil War. Whether it's the first or if there will be others after that, we have yet to see. But anyway, DuPont did make a lot of contributions. I mean, they were a chemical company, so no wonder that they saw better living through chemistry, because they were developing nylon. These are familiar names to you: nylon, neoprene, Teflon, Mylar, Kevlar, and Lycra. Interestingly, they introduced phenothiazine as an insecticide. Where else do you use phenothiazine? Where in your world, where in your medical practice have you seen or heard about phenothiazine as a psychoactive drug, right? But it began as an insecticide. And for those of you that are interested in chemistry, methylene blue is derived from phenothiazine. So chemistry is quite an interesting domain of study. So naturally, I mean, we as physicians and veterinarians, we study this in med or vet school or even undergraduate to get into these programs, but they still have tendrils that are continuing on. So we got to just think clearly. The company also created Freon and other refrigerants, as well as synthetic pigments and paints. So things that were useful for wars, for farming, and they really dominated in the explosives business, and they promoted this farming with dynamite. So if there's a tree trunk in your way and you need to plow that field, blow it up. And yeah, it was fast and I guess efficient. The promise of DuPont. This DuPont song, which you can find on YouTube, and you can see the dancers that will sing and dance to it for you, from the 1964 World's Fair, New York World's Fair. So think of the meetings that you go to or used to go to as a veterinarian, and how big they are, and there's a lot of showmanship to it, and even certain meetings will hire big talent or medium talent anyway. And so it's this big event, and you see all these drug company signs and everything. And how different is that from the World's Fair, where they say, and maybe I can sing it for you: better things for better living through chemistry, for the finer world we want. Better things for better living through chemistry. That's the promise of DuPont. Every day that we are living is such a thrill that we can't stay nonchalant. Better things for better living are coming still. That's the promise of DuPont. So, or you can check out the version that was originally shown at the 1964 World's Fair. Anyway, so really cultivating this acceptance and enthusiasm for chemistry. Nowadays, DuPont makes and sells genetically, see, I think I might have had some this morning, GMOs, genetically modified seed. And genes that go into their product include Liberty Link, which provides resistance to various herbicides like glyphosate, Roundup. And then in 2017, DuPont merged with Dow Chemical Company to create Dow DuPont, the world's largest chemical company in terms of sales. So things were going along sort of swimmingly. And let's see, we have a question. Oh, yeah, Millie says, don't quit your day job. Yeah. Okay, I'll work on my singing. I like rap a little bit better, but I get your point. But I just had to bring out my little pup that looks like Maverick, who we are introducing for our new EMAV program, our entirely online, interactive, remote learning, heavily coached medical acupuncture for veterinarians course. And you get a little dog. Looks like this. He's a Jack Russell Terrier. He's not alive, but he looks it. You get him through the mail. So his name is Maverick. More on that to come. Anyhow, the lawyer that became DuPont's worst nightmare, from the New York Times. So here they were going on and doing lots of things, but not necessarily getting held accountable for it. So this guy, Rob Bilott, a corporate defense attorney for 8 years, who actually used to work to represent corporate, industry kind of thing, defend them. He then took on this environmental lawsuit that changed his career. And so this was written up in the New York Times. And I have many quotes from this story because it exemplifies some of the things that we are up against, even if we wanted to become somewhat of an advocate for this. And in so doing, as they say in this article, he exposed a brazen, decades-long history of chemical pollution. So all this time, remember, DuPont had been around for a long time, and it's not just picking on DuPont, but this is a consequence in part of cultivating this acceptance, enthusiasm, song, and dance for chemical companies, and then we might extrapolate that to the pharmaceutical industry. And because Dow DuPont had a pharmaceutical, or DuPont before they merged, they've had to divest somewhat because of like the Sherman Act and other things. They were getting too big, so they did have to carve off companies. But when you're talking about chemical, environmental impacts, don't think that that is completely divorced from pharmaceuticals. So here's the story, and it involves veterinarians too, which makes it relevant even more for us. So we'll get to the drug company thing, but this is how certain things unfold, and how you have to have the right people involved for something even to make a meaningful change. And what happened as a result of this investigation with this corporate attorney was that there were laws impacted. There was a lot of problematic, just goings on from these companies that were brought to the surface. And so things had changed, and then we'll see how things are kind of slipping backwards. So it began with a call from a farmer. The farmer, Wilbur Tennant of Parkersburg, West Virginia, said that his cows were dying left and right. So think about this. If you're a large animal veterinarian, how often do you think of environmental polluters when you have animals that are becoming sick? If you are an equine vet, how many barns do you visit where there's spray coming out from the ceiling, or just completely just round the clock perfusing the environment with insecticides? How does that differ from one barn to another in the types of quality of care that they give? So here, these cows were dying. He believed that the DuPont Chemical Company, which until recently operated a site in Parkersburg that is more than 35 times the size of the Pentagon, was responsible. So here's a farmer, his cows are dying, and what do? He had tried to seek help locally, but DuPont just about owned the entire town. He had been spurned not only by Parkersburg's lawyers, but also by its politicians, journalists, doctors, and veterinarians. So, I have some polls in here that I want to get your impressions of how you would operate. And it's going to be anonymous, so I'd like everybody to participate. But how do you live with yourself when there's something like that? But I know that sometimes there can be a big player in a community, could be a university, and once they tap into most of the really good lawyers in town, then if you, as somebody that would want to defend yourself against something, you go to certain lawyers in your community, and it's like, nope, conflict of interest, I'm working for blah, 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 and so I can't represent you. So just be aware of that. This is not an isolated event, but look at how bought up everybody was, and he couldn't get any help. Physicians, veterinarians, everybody. The farmer was angry and spoke in a heavy Appalachian accent. Billot struggled to make sense of everything he was saying. He might have hung up on Tennant had Tennant not blurted out the name of Billot's grandmother, Alma Holland White. So an interesting twist. Sometimes things work out this way. So his grandmother had lived in Vienna, a northern suburb of Parkersburg, and as a child, Billot often visited her during the summer. In 1973, she brought him to the cattle farm. So another link. something personal, belonging to the tenant's neighbors, the Grahams, with whom White was friendly. Billot spent the weekend riding horses, milking cows, and watching Secretariat win the Triple Crown on TV. He was 7 years old. The visit to the Grahams' farm was one of his happiest childhood memories. Okay, so when the Grahams heard in 1998 that Wilbur Tennant was looking for legal help, they remembered Billot, White's grandson, who had grown up to become an environmental lawyer. They did not understand, however, that Billot was not the right kind of environmental lawyer. He did not represent plaintiffs or private citizens. Like the other 200 lawyers at his law firm, a firm founded in 1885 and tied historically to the family of President William Howard Taft, Billot worked almost exclusively for large corporate clients. His specialty was defending chemical companies. So had the farmer decide to contact this guy? Every little piece had to fit together. Several times Billot had even worked on cases with DuPont lawyers. Nevertheless, as a favor to his grandmother, he agreed to meet the farmer. It just felt like the right thing to do, he says today. I felt a connection to these folks. So, connection, meaning people working based on principles. Wilbur Tennant explained that he and his 4 siblings had run the cattle farm since their father abandoned them as children. They had 7 cows then. Over the decades, they steadily acquired land and cattle until 200 cows roamed more than 600 hilly acres. The property would have been even larger had his brother Jim and Jim's wife not sold 66 acres in the early 1980s to DuPont. Key feature here. The company, hey, I want to use the plot for landfill from its factory for waste, and they called Washington Works, where Jim was employed as a laborer. Jim and Della didn't want to sell, but Jim had been in poor health, mystery ailments that doctors couldn't diagnose, and they needed the money. So here, these people were already being sickened by the stuff that DuPont was doing in the town, and DuPont wants this land, which ultimately they're going to dump a whole bunch of horrible chemicals in, and there's just parallels to today. Keep people poor, keep them uninsured, keep them from being able to afford medicines, and then they're even more sick, and then they are unable to fend for themselves, essentially. And who's going to fight for them when everybody's bought up into this malevolent thought pattern? DuPont rechristened the plot Dry Run Landfill, named after the creek that ran through it. The same creek flowed down to a pasture where the tenants grazed their cows. Not long after the sale, Wilbur told Billot, the cattle began to act deranged. They had always been like pets to the tenants. At the sight of a tenant, they would amble over, nuzzle, and let themselves be milked. No longer. Now, when they saw the farmers, they charged. Again, as a veterinarian, what would be your first thought? Might be rabies, might be something else. Would you think about the chemical plant? Would you dare to say anything if your spouse was making a good living there, or whatever? It's just, this is not that long ago. Then the farmer shows Billot a video and says, I've taken 2 dead deer and 2 dead cattle off this ripple. The blood runs out of their noses and out of their mouths. They're trying to cover this stuff up, but it's not going to be covered up because I'm going to bring it out in the open for people to see. And so he showed Billot a video with a large pipe running into the creek, discharging green water with bubbles on the surface. He says, this is what they expect a man's cows to drink on his own property. So again, if you're out there, do you take a look around on the land? Do you try to see what contamination is there? Do you run soil samples? How much investigation do you do? Or do you just say, okay, well, give them some bute or whatever you would give cow like this, or if they were acting poorly, I don't know. But it takes a lot of time and actually potentially money. At one point, the video cuts to a skinny red cow standing in hay. Patches of its hair are missing and its back is humped. A result, Wilbur speculates, of a kidney malfunction. Another blast of static is followed by a close-up of a dead black calf lying in the snow, its eye a brilliant chemical blue. So by now, you'd pretty much be expecting to think something was going on, like chemistry. Better living through chemistry, eh? 153 of these animals I've lost on this farm. Every veterinarian that I've called in Parkersburg, they will not return my phone call, or would they want to get involved? Does this comport with your veterinarian's oath? Just asking. Since they don't want to get involved, I'll have to dissect this thing myself. I'm going to start at the head. The video cuts to a calf's bisected head. Close-ups follow of the calf's blackened teeth. And he says, they say that's due to high concentrations of fluoride in the water that they drink. Its liver, heart, stomachs, kidneys, and gallbladder, each organ is sliced open, and Wilbur points out unusual discoloration, some dark, some green, and crazy textures. So the lawyer watched the video and looked at the photographs that he had, and he saw cows with stringy tails, malformed hooves, giant lesions protruding from their hides, and red receded eyes. Cows suffering constant diarrhea, slobbering white slime, the consistency of toothpaste, staggering bow-legged like drunks. So the lawyer was very upset with this. He filed a federal lawsuit against DuPont in the summer of 1999 in the Southern District of West Virginia. In response, DuPont's in-house lawyer, Bernard Riley, informed him that DuPont and the EPA would commission a study of the property conducted by 3 veterinarians chosen by DuPont and 3 chosen by the EPA. So, Paul, if you couldn't find a job otherwise, would you work for a suspected environmental polluter? So I'd like everybody to take the poll. I'm going to launch it. Feel free to answer as you feel is right. And poll in progress for attendees, and share results. If you couldn't find a job, would you work for a suspected environmental polluter? No, 100%. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I would rather drive a delivery truck. I'd rather do anything. Maybe people have issues, but and you have things that press on you, but you still have your soul that you need to attend to. So anyway, they did this study, and their report did not find, amazingly, DuPont to be responsible for the cattle's health problems. The culprit instead was poor husbandry, poor nutrition, inadequate veterinary care, and lack of fly control. In other words, the tenants didn't know how to raise cattle. If the cows were dying, it's your own dang fault. So this didn't sit well with the tenants, who began to suffer the consequences of antagonizing Parkersburg main employer. People just shunned them. They walked out of restaurants when they entered. I'm not allowed to talk to you, they said when confronted. 4 different times, the tenants changed churches. With the trial looming, Bill Ott, so I'm jumping around in the article. There's a lot more for that if you want to read it in depth. But there were known problems. Bill Ott found this letter that DuPont had sent to the EPA, and it was named PFOA. And so Bill Ott had never heard of this, even though he had worked with a bunch of chemical companies. And it didn't appear on any of the lists of regulated materials, nor could he find it in Taft's in-house library. So this is something that just kind of fell through the cracks, because there's regulations on what you can study and what gets called upon as potentially injurious. The chemistry expert that he'd retained for the case did, however, fortunately, I mean, how things just come about, fortunately, there was somebody that felt or did or learned or knew something. This chemistry expert vaguely recalled an article in a trade journal about a similar sounding compound, PFOS, a soap-like agent used by the technology conglomerate 3M in the fabrication of Scotchgard. How many of you know about issues with Scotchgard? I don't have a poll here, but I think you should if you're thinking of using that. Anyway, and so what Bill Ott got was over 100,000 pages of documents. He read through all of them, and he saw all this incriminating material that DuPont had sent him. And maybe they just didn't realize what they were giving over. He said it's one of those things where you can't believe you're reading what you're reading, that it's actually been put in writing. It was the kind of stuff you always heard about happening, but you never thought you'd see written down. And so just, again, as an aside, and this isn't a poll, but think about the cows that didn't die. Think about the cows that were still being poisoned, but weren't frothing toothpaste from like substances from their mouths, or any number of permutations of that across the country, across the globe, in other countries where there are not the same types of regulations, even though ours are being weakened. But what happens to toxic laden meat? It's similar to when we discussed the problems and pitfalls of traditional Chinese veterinary medicine and its, so to speak, herbal compounds. When you have these herbs or anything that's being chosen from a country or a hillside or wherever, and then you got the middle person, the middle company that's procuring these from all different types of sources. You're not there. You don't know the quality of farming, agriculture, the types of pesticides being used. And even if something is organic, what does that really mean? Does it mean you can't apply pesticides? Well, what if you have DuPont next door putting out all this green bubbly water in the irrigation? I mean, how much is organic food even tested for other things? Or is it like, okay, we're just looking for these pesticides, and if you put something else on there, we're not going to find it? So, but yeah, with meats and the amount of concentration of chemicals in the tissues, and one of our courses recently, we had a veterinarian who was just talking about the raising of catfish and how you have to just pummel them with so many just anti, parasites and all kinds of chemicals, because if you let up at all, then the growing conditions. I mean, not saying that he grew these, but he is aware of these practices where, and that has happened quite a bit in China, but even in his exposure to the growth of corn, and just how much is all just dumped there. Like, if you don't realize the need to eat organic food, you should study more on that. I was out at a bike ride with a friend one time, and nearby, and this crop duster came by, kind of dusted us a little bit too, because of course they probably don't like bike riders looking at what's going on, but it was gross. So anyway, by 1990, DuPont had dumped 7,100 tons of this PFOA sludge into dry run landfill, and that they knew that this was going into tenants' remaining property. Remember, they said, and they had their veterinarians say, this must be poor husbandry. Yet they had known that this water was a problem. It contained extraordinarily high concentrations of PFOA. They didn't tell this, they didn't disclose it in the cattle report. And Bilot had what he needed, but he still had a very uphill battle. And again, when we think of, if we're going to buck the system, how are we going to do it? If we're going to expose some kind of big cover-up, how do we do it? Who do we have? And can things magically come together? How are we going to live our lives and be aware of this, be cognizant of the problems? How much are we attending to this in our day-to-day veterinary practice? What are we seeing? What are we asking about? What are our even small animals being exposed to day to day? Anyway, the story goes on to how it lifted the curtain on his whole new theater. Before this letter that he ended up writing, corporations could rely upon the public misperception, better living through chemistry, that if a chemical was dangerous, it was regulated. So isn't that what we think now? That somebody is watching, right? That the EPA should be watching, that the FDA should be watching, and that you're only going to allow things into foodstuffs or care products or whatever if it's been shown to be safe and, hopefully effective. So that's what we still rely on to this day. But says this arrangement, which largely allows chemical companies to regulate themselves, is the reason that the EPA has restricted only 5 chemicals out of tens of thousands on the market in the last 40 years. And then the story goes on, it talks about the water. We know there's still water problems across the country today. And then just this issue, how people remembered, oh yeah, so-and-so's first husband was a chemist, and it was involved in, ultimately this Teflon flu that he would bring home. But when you worked at DuPont, and think of any big company, when you worked at DuPont in this town, you could have everything you wanted: your education, your mortgage, generous salary, and you can get some of that free PFOA, use it in your dishwasher and use it to clean the car. And here, as she says, sometimes her husband came home from work sick, fever, nausea, diarrhea, vomiting after working in one of the storage tanks. It was a common occurrence at Washington Works. Darlene said the men at the plant called it the Teflon flu. So question, just no poll, but do you still have Teflon in your house? Do you use it? You know, of course, that it's toxic to birds, but how toxic is it to you and your baby or something and your pets? So what are we up against when we fight back? Just more and more. They treated me like I had the plague. They told me it's nothing to worry about. I got shut down. They were just plain rude. And now think of it today, what's going on. So just looking at that case, like, oh, that was so backwards. That was in the 1990s. What's going on today? New York Times. I have the link there. The Trump administration is reversing 100 environmental rules. Here's the list. And these are rules that have been put together over all these decades. So 68 environmental safety rules already dealt with, gone. 32 are in progress. And here's the breakdown. Reversing control over air pollution and emissions, drilling and extraction, infrastructure and planning, animal care, raising, all these things, water pollution, toxic substances and safety, and other. And then as we start to think about pharmaceuticals, and well, that couldn't happen to that drug. That I've used that drug for decades. I can't see where the generic would be a problem. You know, it's produced by this company or it's sold to me by my local drug supplier, and it can't be that. What are you doing at home that's different or something? But from July of last year, FDA enforcement actions plummet under Trump, from monitoring clinical trials and approving medicines and vaccines to ensuring the safety of blood transfusions, medical devices, groceries, and more. The US FDA is one of the nation's most vital watchdogs. By several measures, however, FDA's compliance and enforcement actions have plummeted since Trump took office. And this is from Science Magazine, who, if you can, you should support because they rely on that. So here you can see just the amount of enforcement actions that have dropped over the past 4 years, the decline in warning letters. So just saying this so that you're aware that if you're hoping that the stuff you're getting that are being implanted into your or someone else's body are safe, I mean, just as some people say, those who think the Trump administration has not succeeded in its deregulatory efforts ought to look at the data. And so it's all over the place that there are issues. So what about pharmaceuticals? Here's a poll. Which of the following contributes heavily to veterinary schools? So getting into corporate control, corporate influence in academia. And this is, I believe, select one or more. So select all that apply. So here's a poll for you guys. And is it Big Pharma? Is it Big Rehab? So are people selling all kinds of those plastic donuts, like, and influencing the recommendations of the one rehab veterinarian at the school that might be purchasing a donut from one company versus another? These aren't your Munchie donuts. These are what you're putting a dog on to balance. So how many of these are influencing veterinary schools through their donations? Big Pharma, Big Rehab, Big Cannabis, Big Pet Food, and China. I raised China because there are schools in the Southeast that do or have received, I've written about this in Veterinary Practice News way long ago, but you know, when you're giving tens of thousands of dollars to a school, yeah, maybe that's not as much as a drug company might do, but tens of thousands to create a program in nutrition that will be very friendly to Chinese medicine, Chinese herbs, a Chinese just mentality, way of looking at, you know, just medicine. And remember in our problems and pitfalls webinar, how we talked about China, and I'm not saying this happens, but China is trying to influence what goes on in at least human medicine, and how much does that affect veterinary medicine. So I'm going to close the poll. Thank you for voting, and share results. Which of the following contributes heavily to veterinary schools? Big Pharma and Big Pet Food, far and away. Now, rehab, probably not as much, but who knows what we'll see. Big Cannabis, yeah, if they only could, they would love that, and possibly China. We don't know, and how would we find out? So thank you for that. Here's another poll, kind of similar. Who contributes heavily to veterinary continuing education meetings when you see all this? And so it's sort of the same thing, but I added big nutraceuticals because there are, depending on which meeting they used to go to anyway, they would be there quite heavily as well. But yeah, I didn't create a poll for that, but I think you get the idea. And now think about how many insecticides you prescribe for your patients, whether you're a large animal vet, a small animal vet. I talked about the, sort of the cattle issues, the horse issues, horse barns, and think about small animal. Think of what you're putting out there. And just a question, how many, would you take as many insecticides as you prescribe for your patients? So I'm going to launch that poll. I mean, would you do this for yourself? Thank you for voting. So would you take as many insecticides as you prescribe for your patients? Yeah, pretty clearly, no. I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So 100% said no. So, I mean, we don't get fleas in the same way. I realize we're not at that level and we're getting ticks and all that. So, but just there is a big difference there. And why do we have to be so reliant on that? And yeah, I mean, there's heartworm. I mean, is it a done deal, or are there any other options? And I can't say that I know that, but it's a big difference. So, practicing human medicine and veterinary medicine, it's like there's this whole equation of what is the safety of each of those things alone and in conjunction that we have maybe never been told about. Okay, another poll. Do you feel comfortable getting a COVID vaccine this year? So realizing that it's just been developed and maybe you think it's fine, would you get one this year? Do you feel comfortable about that? And whatever you want to say is fine. It's completely fine with me. I'm going to give a couple more seconds here. Okay, we'll close the poll, share results. And so about 3/4 of you said no, and about 1/4 of you roughly said yes. So it's maybe a little bit different than the general public, which I think is almost about 50-50. Do you see a problem with insecticides levels in horse barns or livestock facilities? And we'll launch that because I've told you my impression. Do you think that there's an issue or not? And I'm just wanting your opinion because maybe you've never thought of it before. And when you go back to those, even if you have horses of your own or you raise sheep or something, have you thought about the exposure to you and your family and your animals with that? Okay, great. So I'm going to close the poll, share the results. So those of you voted that you said yes, 100% of you thought that there was a problem. So I agree. Are you concerned about the amount of synthetic chemicals in human food? Yes or no? I'm going to launch the poll. I put a bunch rapid fire so I would get all of your opinions in one spot, more or less. I'm not saying there aren't any polls in the future here, but I just had to see like what you guys are thinking of things. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. All right. So share results. Yes, you are concerned about the amount of synthetic chemicals in food. I mean, I'm a vegan, and even some of the vegan stuff can be questionable. If it's vegan or organic, that's a different thing, but you don't always get that. Now, are you concerned about the amount of synthetic chemicals in animal food? And I'm not talking about the stuff you make yourself, but just what's out there. Are you concerned about the amount of synthetic chemicals? Now, and you think about the ingredients, what is in there? Have you read the labels lately? Have you read cat foods, mainstream supermarket or boutique or whatever? Have you read those labels? Do you see synthetic chemicals? And is it an issue? What about now we're seeing, it's interesting how the holistic or integrative field, those that have been interested in nutrition and real food, have influenced big pet food, because now you see these natural lines that have no artificial colors, no artificial flavors. And of course, my cats don't like that as much, but I'm sort of foisting a lot of it on them. But they don't like it as much, clearly, because it doesn't have whatever kind of interesting flavor. Okay, I'm going to close the poll, share results. Yeah, 100% of you good. You don't have to please me, but I'm just saying, yes. Were the dangers of drugs, in your opinion, emphasized sufficiently in veterinary school? So when you were learning about the medications you were prescribing, were you told about the risks that they could produce? Were you told about what you should look for? Were you told what you should tell the clients? Were you told about herb drug interactions? Were you told about drug interactions? Were you told about long-term effects? Were you told about exposure to children in the family should they get into it? So good. So I'm going to close the poll and share results. So 75% of you roughly said you were not given enough information. Essentially, it wasn't emphasized enough in vet school. And about a quarter of you thought that was fine, and that's okay. It matters where you go and who you had for pharmacology. And then were the dangers of human exposure. I'm not even going to run that, but yeah, like what I meant was when you're applying certain flea and tick products to the surface of the animal, what is your risk of exposure? What's your risk of exposure, or what's the client's risk of exposure when they're pregnant? Just unwitting kinds of things. Think of too, for humans, when you have some kind of hormonal cream or a patch, birth control things or whatever, and or some kind of THC salve that you might use on yourself, and then so you go for a massage or whatever it is, that somebody else might pick that up, and what's the risk there? So kind of similar things with animal stuff. Okay, Paul, for the idea, get them while they're young, poor, and impressionable. And I think back to when I was a medical student and how we would have this day, and I was so surprised when I learned about it, a day when all the drug companies would come and they'd fill this big lab and they'd have all their toys. And I felt I was quite advanced when I brought just a trash bag with me, because everybody else would be like holding their little gizmos and little vertebrae toys and everything. I just figured, hey, I'm gonna just do it right. I brought a trash bag and I just piled all the stuff in. I don't even know whatever happened to it because you just don't really use that. But this was the way of getting us as human future doctors to be just kind of like, oh, this is like a toy shop right here. So as a student, did you ever think you were being groomed as a salesperson for big pet food? Yes, no, or prefer not to answer because you're getting a lot of money from that in your practice. There's the poll. Did you ever think you were being groomed as a salesperson for big pet food? Think about how, I mean, back in the day, we would get free big pet food. And then things, I never did it, so I don't really know all the ins and outs, but they started to tighten it up after I was there for 20 years or so. And so I will close the poll. Thank you for voting and share results. Did you ever think you were being groomed as a salesperson for big pet food as a student? Yes, half of you. No, quarter of you. Prefer not to answer. Understandably, I get it. I get it. Anyways, just moving into this pharmaceutical thing, this last piece of things, there is this hour-plus long documentary on YouTube, and there's the link there, but you could just, I forget if it's called Drugs or it's something else, but narrated by this Academy Award winner. In a titanic struggle against corporate greed, see how a diverse group of concerned Americans is fighting back to keep life-saving medicines affordable for us all. And it just talks about this way that you keep the medicines out of reach, and you're just disempowering people and then making them so dependent on things that they shouldn't maybe even have had to become dependent on. And that was just from 2018. And then here, the Young Turks had this video, How Big Pharma Bribes Doctors, if you want to look at that. And when we have this video on YouTube, then you can see that link again, or just look for it yourself. And they delineate in this story that was exposed the types of physician bribery there is, whether it's NASCAR races, NBA tickets, hunting trips, concert tickets, or actually monetary payouts. And so this story that they reported on talked about the payouts to doctors, incentivizes physicians to prescribe medications for patients when they get kickbacks. And so from over 7-year period, 2009 to 2016, what were those years covering? Who was president then? The Justice Department recovered $19.3 billion in settlements and judgments related to healthcare fraud. Whatever their fines, though, they're just going to charge it back to us, the cost of doing business, they say. So that was somebody that they interviewed. And here from Ars Technica from 2019, there was a report entitled on a report, more than half of all U.S. doctors get money from pharma each year. The payouts aren't changing despite newer disclosure requirements. So think about this when you go in for your annual this or that, or you have a problem. Like I said about your instructors in vet school or med school or wherever, like where's their loyalty? There should be just real transparency. Who's paying you to do what? Who's paying you at a meeting to say, oh yeah, I use such and such? It's so corruptible. So they say between 2014 and 2018, more than 600,000 of the approximately 1.1 million, so that's over half, right? Doctors in the U.S. received at least one payment from industry in any given year. Payments for speaking fees, consulting, meals, gifts, travel, royalties. While thousands of doctors have made $100,000 or more than 2,500 have received $500,000 or more in the 5-year period, and those payments do not include royalties, and more than 700 physicians received at least $1 million from drug companies. So the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare in 2010, had included this open payments initiative. So it required companies to disclose payments. And it's, as they say, the idea behind the initiative was such that just this transparency might dissuade industry payments to physicians, which research has shown time and again influences prescribing and care practices. So somebody that you love or yourself or kid or whatever, wouldn't you be mad? I mean, better living through chemistry, yeah. So we softened, we thought, okay, this is great. We're so conditioned that when you have a problem, you're going to get some kind of pill or prescription instead of a treatment like massage and acupuncture. So that's actually the thrust of this is how can you get out of this rabbit hole or whatever hole we're in and change medicine as a medical caregiver, that how can we create a different kind of consciousness that does not sink people financially, does not create all these other secondary problems as a result of the medication. And then they found, but researchers and industry watchers see little change in spending levels and the number of physicians accepting payments. A 2017 analysis on the drugs that prompted the most physician promotion payments from doctors found that they tended to be drugs that are less likely than top selling and top prescribed drugs to be effective. So they are less likely than the best drugs, less likely to be effective, to be safe, to be affordable, to be novel, and to represent a genuine advance to treating disease. So here is the problem of things that happen behind the screen that you as a healthcare consumer or patient or whatever you want to call it, you don't even know that this is going on, that you're being prescribed a substandard, subideal drug because that physician has split loyalties or is loyal maybe to something else more. So from the British Medical Journal, here is a podcast of sorts. It's an audio kind of interview on U.S. drug marketing. How does promotion correspond with health value? So showing the data that these promotional liaisons do influence how people are prescribing things. So what about scientific integrative medicine that we practice? So just as an example, because this is the stuff that I spend most of the time doing my webinars on, and next week we're going to talk about spinal cord injury and things that students are not learning about in veterinary school that would give them the broader understanding of why you don't just plunge in and rip apart that back and take out whatever teeny little thing is there and then call it good and, stay in a box for 8 weeks. That there's so much better ways to provide care for spinal cord injured patients than just that, whether or not there is surgery, but surgery is not just a slam dunk. And we have to change our default procedures and our default mentality and our fear of recommending science-based integrative medicine by being transparent and say, here's what happens with this, here's what happens with this, what do you think you'd like to do? Do you have any more questions for me? But just taking as an example, acupuncture versus medication, doesn't have to be either or. It can be both. But here's a study produced in acupuncture medicine, acupuncture versus medication for pain management, a cross-sectional study of breast cancer survivors. And here they found similar rates of preference for acupuncture and medication among breast cancer survivors for pain management. So at least, why can't we offer both? And then the recipients don't have to suffer the ill effects of the medication, or they can have that as kind of a rescue thing, as a thing where it's you couldn't get to your acupuncturist because there's a pandemic or whatever happened, but we need to just get this up to the front of the line, and that is by speaking out, which is why I'm doing my webinar series. Acupuncture for migraines. So many people have migraines, and I find that, acupuncture, massage. I used to get migraines. It's very rare that I get them now, but I started getting regular massage many years ago when I was back in vet school. And because I generally like massage better than acupuncture, because I just like massage better. But I think for my patients, I'll do acupuncture. And here, this study in Headache 2015 reviews large and well-designed trials of acupuncture for migraine prevention, and also the effectiveness of acupuncture when tried against proven migraine preventative measures. Seems to be at least as effective as a conventional drug preventive therapy for migraine, and is safe, long-lasting, and cost-effective. It's a complex intervention that may prompt lifestyle changes that can be valuable in patients' recovery. Now, not all acupuncture is the same, because are you going to have somebody that is adequately going to work out like where the headache is originating, where the myofascial pieces are? So there's always where you could have a training program, you could have an understanding of how acupuncture, neuromodulation, connective tissue effects actually impacts the generation and prevention of migraines, such that you are more pinpoint, so to speak, on in ways that will make a more meaningful difference. So it's hard when you group all kinds of studies. But then again, here, 2019 systematic review of episodic migraine prophylaxis, efficacy of conventional treatments used in comparisons with acupuncture. These findings, they just strengthened Lynn's studies back in 2016 and showed that moderate evidence suggests that acupuncture is at least non-inferior to now proven conventional treatments. So you have Big Pharma really pressing migraine treatments. You can see it on television, cable, whatever. Who's advocating for acupuncture? Who is telling that same population base that, you know what, that list of adverse effects that they ran through really quickly, and sometimes not necessarily for migraines, but sometimes they'll say and even death, that typically does not happen with acupuncture. So as more of a wrap up, conceptual question: what do you do when your employer tells you, like classmates of mine would tell me after they graduated, when they tell you to push the drugs, push the products, push the procedures as a condition of your employment? We knew we didn't want to work for an environmental polluter, but what happens when you're working for a patient polluter, when you're doing things that aren't necessary because that's a condition of your employment? What would you do if you learned of a cluster of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis cases in Nebraska cattle farmers? Because I learned of that because I was seeing one of them. And, did I create a huge hoopla? No. I treated this patient that came to me with ALS, seeking help from this degenerative condition that really only later in our treatment course, it seemed like it may have slowed it down, but this person had to come from Nebraska for each treatment. So it was an uphill battle in that way. But then I learned there were several cattle farmers. There was a cluster of cases there that you wouldn't usually see ALS. And think about all the exposures that they had. Think of our risk of exposures as veterinarians to toxic things. Anyways, what would you do if the horses in a barn were all falling ill to a neurologic chronic pain problem, chronic problem that was manifesting either some kind of neurologic issue that you thought was due to insecticides being administered or applied? What do you do? What do you do? And how do you protect yourself and your clinic staff from harmful chemical exposures? What do we do? What products are recommended to us? What do we agree is safe and effective? How much are we exposing the patients that are in there to it? I've seen clinics where the concentrations were not made right, and you could smell that bleach, and they would also use that same bleach concentration in the restrooms. And if you go in there, it's like, this is a crazy toxic environment. And yet what do the animals do that are in cages from whatever they're recuperating from? They're 100% of the time. How do you protect yourself and your family, including your animals, from harmful chemical exposures at your house, not only your clinic? So general overall thing, think independently, realize that your government may not be out to protect you at this point. What are you going to do, and how are you going to navigate that? So quick promotion here, but just when we're thinking of scientific integrative medicine and how do we bring that to the forefront, the reason we offer our pain rehab and integrative medicine advantage certification is because in order to do that, in order to have this robust treatment approach, it's not that we're not ever going to use drugs or surgery, but we want to bring everything to bear. We want medical acupuncture, medical massage, photomedicine, botanical options, and rehabilitation. Bring that to the fore, and then you really have that diversity of education and application to address a lot of problems with scientific integrative medicine as first-line care. So curacore.org/vet/prima, PRIMA, if you want to look more at that certification program. So as always, if you have any questions, then feel free to email me, narda@curacore.org. Thank you, Millie, for your note. I appreciate that. And yeah, go out there, be honest, be transparent, and fight. That's what I do. Thanks. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.